Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode. This week I've got Pastor Jimmy Scroggins. He is the lead pastor at Family Church in South Florida. And we're going to talk through different things connected to personal growth in terms of our spiritual development and in terms of professional development and how that can speak into pastoring well and dealing with challenges as they come along. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week, I'm blessed to have Jimmy Scroggins with me. He is the lead pastor at Family Church in South Florida. Jimmy, welcome. Thanks for being here with me today.
Oh man, glad to be with you.
Tell me a little bit, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, your history and ministry, things like that.
Sure. So I live in West Palm Beach, Florida. I'm the pastor of Family Church. Used to be called the First Baptist Church of West Palm Beach. This church was started here in 1901 in this neighborhood. And until 2010, we were one church in one location, speaking one language. And now we're a church in 15 locations, speaking 4 languages across 3 counties.
Oh, wow.
My wife, Chris, and I have been married for 30 years. We both grew up in Florida. We have 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. And then we have 2 daughters-in-law and 4 grandchildren. And, we've grew up in Florida, went to college here in Florida. We graduated, we felt called to ministry. We moved to Louisville, Kentucky. We went to Southern Seminary in Louisville and then stayed in Louisville for about 15 years in that area. And I worked in student ministry, became a teaching pastor at a church. Our church became multi-site, and I was involved in the beginnings of the multi-site movement in that way. Became a professor at Southern Seminary, became a dean at Southern Seminary. And then in 2008, we were called here to what was then the First Baptist Church of West Palm Beach. And then we've been here for 16 years.
All right. I didn't realize that you had that extensive a background at Southern, that you'd actually served there for a while on faculty and as a dean.
Yeah,
I didn't realize you'd
that's
done
right.
that. So what was your primary area? What do you teach?
So I mostly taught missions, but then I also did some, practical ministry too. Like I love to teach student ministry or discipleship or evangelism, things like that. So my PhD focused on missions and evangelism. But mostly what I was trying to do when I was there as a dean, what I was trying to organize, I was over Boyce College, which is their undergraduate program at Southern Seminary.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So we were trying to organize that school and position it for growth and try to treat it like a real college instead of a sidebar thing of the seminary. And God's really used that a lot. In fact, I was just there this week and was able to speak there and reconnect. It was really a lot. I love going back there. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. So yeah, I heard you talking about the number of years you were in Louisville, and so when I was at Southwestern, my wife and Julie and I were there for 8 years, just taking our time going through and doing ministry along the way. And my minor was actually in student ministry, so that was something I spent some extra time studying. I did a lot of my counseling with teenagers, and even later on after I left Southwestern and we were in Maryland with North American Mission Board, I did a lot of counseling with teenagers and kids and stuff. So I'm passionate about that area. So with all that being said, the main thing we typically talk about on the podcast is, so what are some of the top 2 or 3 greatest challenges you've seen or experienced in ministry? And what are some of the things that you would suggest for dealing with those challenges?
I mean, I could tell you challenge after challenge after challenge. So I think there's challenges that fall into different buckets. Mm-hmm. I would say, the first one would have to do with shepherding your own soul in the middle of ministry, because you can't, when you're in ministry, you're kind of running down. It's like a train going down the tracks, and so maybe on one of the rails is your personal development, the shepherding of your own soul, your own walk with God. Yep. And the other track is your professional development, or what's happening actually in the ministry that you're overseeing or leading or connected with. And then there's a lot of connections between those two. And so you're trying to constantly manage both rails of the track. And so I do think that on one side, I think shepherding your own soul is a huge challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because, and this is a topic that has come up before, the idea of when the ministry that we do, the whatever ministry we're involved in, it shouldn't be when we're reading scripture, our primary target in reading scripture is how does this apply to ministry? The ministry should come from the overflow of our relationship with the Lord and what he's leading us in. Personally, and that just naturally leads into what we're doing in our ministry in the church. I mean, would you agree with that, the way I'm wording it?
I completely agree with it because, again, if you're a mature Christian, which you should be a mature Christian if you're leading ministry, doesn't mean a perfect Christian, but you should be a mature Christian, a maturing Christian. And so if that's true, then you have to become a self-feeder. So a lot of times when you're leading a ministry,
Yep.
there's no one else's, it's not somebody else's job really to feed you. It's usually your job to feed others. Well, then you have to make sure that your own soul is getting fed somehow. I mean, leadership does not make you immune from temptation, from dry seasons, from sinful motivations, from selfishness. Um, Leadership in ministry doesn't make you immune from any of that. In fact, I think sometimes leadership in ministry makes you more susceptible to those things than other people.
Yep.
And
I
so I
completely
just
agree.
think this idea of just being very disciplined and focused on what does it take to shepherd your own soul. And we could talk about principles for that or things, but the truth is every soul's different, every context is different, every leadership. So it's hard to give a one size fits all, but minimally what you said though is just, then you got to be studying the scriptures for yourself. You got to be talking to God for yourself. And I think you should be sitting under some Bible teaching from someone else somewhere. So, and which is pretty easy to do with technology in today's world.
Yeah. The way I've always talked about and thought about ministry and the idea of how temptation comes along and the things that we deal with for any of us who've ever been in that kind of position. I think through the idea of what are the different views in terms of a heavenly view, kind of the horizontal view, and then the other vertical view. What would Satan's view of us be? Well, if I think of somebody who has embraced a ministry position, the heavenly view, I think, is applause. You've surrendered to the Lord's will. There's excitement when somebody does that. From a horizontal view, I think it's a big question mark a whole lot of the time. Like, okay, I don't know what you're doing. I guess you've signed on to be poor. Like, there's some of those ideas out there that the people just don't get it.
Yeah.
But from a bottom up view, I think it's just a giant bullseye, right? I mean, I think the fiery darts are coming if we have clearly lined ourselves out, that we have set ourselves apart to serve the Lord, then we've set ourselves up as targets. And there's actually a section in, I'm pretty sure it's John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, where he's talking about a friend who was in ministry and just completely stumbled. And he just makes mention of the phrase, the evil one just took him out. The idea of it's definitely not easier to function in that capacity in terms of temptation. There's an evil one that's going to want to thwart what we do, because then it's not only damaging to us, but everybody we've ministered to as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think that you just remember that's the, sometimes we just forget, we get so caught up in reading leadership books and leadership principles and talking about building healthy culture, which all those things I like to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is there's a real God and he's a good God, and there's a real devil and he's a bad devil. And if we ever forget that, and over again in the Bible, the Bible peels back the curtain for us and lets us see that there really are these unseen realities that are interacting and intermingled with our seen realities. And if you ever stop believing in that or forgetting that that's real, you're really not maintaining a biblical worldview. And so I was preaching on Sunday about whenever they were having the Last Supper there with Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. And it just, in the middle of the story, just goes, and Satan entered into Judas Iscariot. And you're like,
yeah,
what just happened? Well, it's because he's peeling back the curtain and he's saying, hey, there's a real devil. And at this moment, the real devil possessed Judas Iscariot and led him to collaborate for the betrayal of Jesus. And so I just think as pastors, if anybody's cognizant of the reality of the devil and the supernatural realm that again is coexisting with and commingling with our physical realm, then you've lost the plot and you're no longer functioning with a Christian worldview. And that's all part of shepherding your own soul, being aware that that's true. Like you just did some
Yeah.
screw tape letters kind of stuff. And I think that
Yeah.
all of us should be aware, that was C.S. Lewis using a really good imagination on how it could be. But I think the ideas that he's putting forth are ideas we should all be keeping in our minds.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. The passage I was thinking of was in Ephesians 6 when it's talking about the full armor of God. There's a section, and this is my huge paraphrase of it, but it's basically remember who the real enemy is.
Yeah, that's right.
He's there and he's real and he's coming after you. And that, for me personally, so one of the things I found is that it's easy it's easy to get bogged down. Like people have done things that have injured me, things that have been harmful, things that seemed hateful at the time. And that passage in particular, even in helping me to understand where they're coming from, the same evil enemy that I strive against, they've strived against too. That same darkness, that's the same thing. And that helps me, at least in those instances, to have some patience, some grace for folks, that they're not just, a horrible person. They're striving against the same sin nature that I am. They're striving against the same evil one that I am. It just helps in keeping that. And like you said, that biblical frame of mind, that biblical frame of reference, the biblical worldview that we have to operate from to do what we do, whether it's lead pastor or youth pastor or a counselor or an educator or whatever, it just has to be there.
Yeah, for sure.
So part of the other thing that you mentioned there, so you talked about the spiritual development. You also talked about professional development, and that's something I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about, because as I listened to your history and ministry, I've heard 3 different places where God has used you to take something that started in one place and see it grow. And so we talked about Boys College being a place where you were serving, and the idea of let's have this grow into something bigger. Family Church grew from a church that was in one language and in one location to, I think you said 15 locations in 4 languages.
Yeah.
But then you also talked about a church before that, back at your time in Louisville, that grew to be a multi-site church. Well, it occurs to me that to lead well, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but when you're going to lead well in a scenario like that, in a situation like that, you have to grow your leadership bucket, your ability to lead, to be able to understand the pivot you have to make from one site to multi-site, things like that. So I would love to hear what you experienced, what were some of the challenges you experienced in that way, and what are some things that really helped you along the way. I would love to hear more about that.
Well, I mean, I think anytime that you're leading through change, I mean, that's why there's people write these massive books about it in every generation, because leading through change is hard. Yeah. And leading through change is challenging. And a lot of people either kind of make their bones and become respected leaders because they were able to lead successfully through change. And a lot of people get thrown out of the game because they couldn't do it.
Yep.
And so, and I personally am of the view, I think there's some skill to it. I think there's some personality to it. I think there's some talent to it. I think there's some principles that can help. But I also think, especially in Christian ministry, Jesus said that the Holy Spirit blows where he wants. And you can't always define why. That's why in ministry, you look around and you go, well, this guy over here is not as talented as I am. I don't even think he's as godly as I am, but somehow his ministry is blowing up and mine's not. So how is that possible? Because the Holy Spirit blows where he wills. That's why.
Yeah.
And you don't know what God's doing through your ministry. There are unseen things that you can't see. God has a better perspective than you do. There are unseen things in me that I can't see, but God sees, and he's got a better perspective than I do. So there's a lot of, I don't know all the whys, but I do know that there are some things that you can do when it comes to leading through change. So some of it has to do with kind of your inputs and who God put in your life along the way to prepare you to lead through change. Of course, some of it has to do, you have to cultivate that to some degree, or at least it's better if you do. So like, I know that I grew up, my dad was a high school football coach, so he never made any money. He wasn't like nationally famous or anything, but he was a very successful high school football coach. And one of the things that my dad did, my dad took a lot of pride in how many assistant coaches that coached with him as the head coach became head coaches. And so I always remember him just taking so much pride in every time one of his assistants would become a head coach.
Yeah.
And that taught me something even as a kid about the value of investing in others. and about seeing your leadership opportunity as an opportunity to help other people become successful. And I feel like there's a lot that can be transferred to ministry in that regard. And so, you know, leading through any kind of change to me is best done through teams, and teams are best built through healthy culture. And healthy cultures, whether it's a big team or a small team, whether it's a team of paid staff or volunteers,
Mm-hmm.
to me, the best thing is that a leader has to lead through love. And so you build your team by leading through love. And every leader leads through some combination of fear and love, carrot and stick.
Yeah, that's a good
Fear
point.
of what I'm going to do to you if you don't do what I want, or it's love. And I really feel like Christ led. There's certainly authority structure between
Yeah.
Jesus and the disciples, but I think he mostly led through love. And I think that if you build a culture of leading through love and caring for people, loving them for who they are instead of what they can do for you,
Yep.
loving them for the best things about them and who they are on their best day instead of constantly holding it over their head who they have been on their worst moment and their worst day. I think trying to find ways to platform people's strengths and cover their weaknesses. And I think if you build a life of doing that with people with whom you serve, then I think it makes whatever comes your way in terms of change a lot more manageable. I think it makes it a lot easier, and I think you'll have a team that's going to collaborate, because the Bible just says, especially in Proverbs, like over and over and
Yeah.
over and over again, you're better off making decisions as a group in most cases. And so I think if you find a strong team that can help you, and then I think some of the ways that I learned to lead through change is I was a faithful and loyal follower. So
Mm.
there's a guy named Albert Mohler who in the 90s, he transitioned Southern Seminary from being a much more liberal seminary to a much healthier and more conservative seminary. And I got to be there with Al as a student and then as a faculty member as he made those changes, and just got to watch and play my role. I certainly wasn't leading the charge, but I was carefully watching
Yep.
how it all happened. And then there's another guy named Kevin Ezel, who was my lead pastor, senior pastor at Highview Baptist Church, where I served for many years in Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I got a lot of responsibility around multi-site and preaching and teaching and so forth. And just watching how he transitioned that church at Highview Baptist Church. It was a struggling situation. He came in and God really used him to revitalize that church. I got to be a part of that from a number 2 seat.
Yeah.
And so just watching how, and look, I don't idolize those men. I don't think they're perfect men. I don't think they're perfect leaders, but I will say they're effective leaders. And getting to listen and learn and watch really taught me a lot, so that when I was in the lead seat, I had some patterns that I had learned and participated in and gotten to see up close.
Yeah. So, and it occurs to me just kind of like what we're talking about with you, where you had experience in multiple instances of doing the multi-site thing and seeing things grow. You just talked about Kevin Ezel and you saw him do church revitalization. Well, it's not lost on me that through NAM, there's a significant focus on church revitalization right now. One of the people I talked to last week is Jamie Caldwell, who's connected to church planning and revitalization up in Maryland, Delaware area, and DC and all that area. So one of the things I'm hearing there then, significant mentoring, following under another leader to be able to see how they do it and grow, which again is a hugely biblical model. It's what we saw Jesus do. It's what we see Jesus telling us to follow after. I mean, even when it comes to our own personal, I'll use the phrase self-care, which is a today phrase more than a Bible phrase, but you need to rest. Watch me learn how I do it is essentially what he's saying in the gospel. So over and over again, that's what we're seeing. And then you also talked about leading from a perspective of love versus fear, and being really intentional about how that leadership works and how building the team works. And as you were talking about that, there were a couple different things I was thinking through in terms of the transparency, the willingness toward vulnerability that has to be involved there, that goes along with that loving, caring, wanting what's best for others, and helping to really grow the team. And so investing in your team. And I like the way you pointed out, it doesn't matter if we're talking about paid staff or volunteer staff,
Yeah.
because many of the churches around are not the multi-site churches, right?
No,
We've
of
got,
course
I
not.
mean, the vast majority of our churches are less than 250 members,
Right.
and, you know, in a lot of instances, a bivocational pastor, not just
Right.
a full-time senior pastor. And so everything we're talking about here is achievable for anybody in a leadership position at a church, no matter how big or small the church
Yeah.
is.
I mean, well, the thing of it is, you know, so sometimes people say that'll be their response. Just I'll say something about leadership or whatever, and they'll say, "Well, that's because you're a family church and you have a big church, you got all this budget and all these employees," and they're right. I mean, at this point, we do have all of that, but that's not the only the things that I learned to lead. I learned to do as a volunteer, leading teams of volunteers, and so I just think the experience of spending years as a volunteer, getting paid nothing, leading teams of volunteers who were paid nothing, taught me a lot. And basically, the same things I learned to do from mentors in those environments, I'm just doing 12.0, but it's the same stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's why I kind of like, okay, I understand why you'd say that. And you can't like the tools available to you are not the same as the tools that might be available to me right now. But that doesn't mean that the principles aren't still the right principles. And if I get fired tomorrow or the economy collapses and we have no money whatsoever around here, we're still going to do some version of the same thing. We're going to lead through love.
Yeah.
We're going to have meetings. We're going to strategize. We're going to take the resources we have and do the best we can. We're not going to compare ourselves to others. We're going to say this is for the Lord. So how do we take the resources we have, do the best we can for the Lord with the opportunity that we have? And if you'll do that, then I think God will honor it and bless it. And the truth is, what else can you do but do the best you can for the Lord with what you have?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's doing the best with what you can for the Lord with what you have. But it's also going back to where you started. It's being in tune with what is the Holy Spirit doing in your midst? Where is he at work? Because he might not be at work in the same way in your church as he is in somebody else's church. There might be different areas of growth that are happening, different things that are happening in terms of what the Lord is in the business of doing there. And so that also circles back to, you've got to stay tuned in your personal relationship so you have that sensitivity to what the Lord is doing around you, what the Holy Spirit is doing.
And look, if you're in ministry and you're kind of struggling because you feel like, man, I'm just in a place where that we don't have resources and we don't have this and we don't have that, you're probably right. I mean, I'm not saying that you're not in a hard spot, but maybe the number one thing, I think one of the best things that could happen to a lot of leaders is just get off social media. Because I think when they get on social media, then they start comparing themselves to everyone else's Instagram posts and everyone else's Twitter posts and everyone else's Facebook posts. And I just think that's death to ministry when you need to step out there with God on faith, and you need to step out there and actually just take advantage of the opportunity you do have from God. And all social media tends to do is cause us to look at what other people claim to be doing in their cultivated posts, instead of just locking in on what does God want me to be doing where I actually am. And I just see so many guys frustrated, discouraged because they can't measure up to the cultivated pictures that others are posting. You know, I just think I'd be careful with that.
Yeah, that actually last year, last spring, I had the chance to speak in chapel here at Southwest Baptist University. And this is part of what I talked about. It's really interesting when you stop and recognize, and I put up a picture. It's this kid who is hitting a golf ball. He's like standing inside some sliding doors, and he's hitting a golf ball out through the doors, and then he closes the doors, and then he closes the doors until the door is only this far open, and every hit's perfect and goes straight out. But when you pause it and look, you can see on the wall right beside the door all of these little golf ball shaped dents in the wall. And he didn't show any of those takes, right? I mean, when we're looking at that, you say cultivated, we're really seeing the top, fraction of a percent of someone's day that they're showing, and that's 100% of what we see is the top fraction of a percent of a whole bunch of people's days. It's interesting. So what I was speaking about in chapel that day was I was talking about how to think through anxiety and fear from a biblical perspective. And what do we do to deal with anxiety and fear? And part of what we have to recognize is some of us are doing some things where we are trying to zone out from those things that make us anxious and maybe just get on and waste some time on social media. And that is causing more anxiety.
Right.
The
Right.
thing we're doing to escape is actually making it worse. It's and so it's mind numbing to me that that's the kind of thing that we do, that's the habit that we've built, and we're all guilty of it. It's not just students. It, like you said, it's pastors, it's moms and dads. I think there are plenty of moms and dads who are on their phone way more often than their teenage kids are,
Yeah.
and it's just not helpful.
Well, I think in a lot of cases it isn't. And so I was thinking, especially if you're a leader who's trying to bring about change, trying to shepherd your own soul, that would just be one place I'd take a hard look and see if that's helping you or hurting you.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, that's not a don't ever be on your screen. Like, stop watching this podcast. You should totally watch this podcast. This
Definitely
is
the
a helpful
podcast.
resource. So feel free to like and subscribe and tell your friends. But bottom line is there are limits to where that value lies, and part of it also speaks into the nature of what's hiding in what we're talking about. Is this a very relational job? I mean, you're talking about loving one another. You're talking about leading well with volunteers. All of that is built on relationship, the credibility we build in the relationships we have with others. And you don't build relationships in the same way when you're just staring at a screen all the time. Like, even right now, as you and I are talking, we're having a conversation, but I'm spending a whole lot of my time looking at my camera rather than looking at you on the screen, because I'm going to be looking down the whole time, right? It's just different than the face-to-face conversations that we tend to have. And so there's got to be that break and that willingness to just connect, which we've got to break away from social media stuff to do.
Yep.
So all that being said, as we're talking about the professional development side of things, as we've talked through the necessities of leading well, I'd be curious to know, are there any particular resources, people you've read, that you have found especially helpful in growing your skill set, growing your understanding of how to lead well?
Yeah, there's several books. I don't have any like silver bullet that would be
Right.
outside the realm of what guys would normally read. So, couple of thoughts. I like to read Francis Schaeffer. He's a Christian philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
I especially like his book, The God Who Is There. That's not specifically about leadership, but it underpins leadership and talks about how God uses culture to constantly reinforce his actual presence and lordship. And so I think that's a good book. There's a business book that came out a long time ago now by Jim Collins called Good to Great.
Mm-hmm.
The funny thing about it is he has all these case studies of these companies that were good companies who became great companies, and he profiles the leaders that helped make those transitions. About half of those companies are now completely out of business, so they didn't really prove to be companies that could last. However, I still think the principles in the book are extremely helpful for leaders in any area. There's a classic book by Robert Coleman, The Master's Plan of Evangelism, which really talks about how Jesus pulled the disciples together, and it is a study of how Jesus interacted with his disciples. I think it's a master class on Christian leadership, and so those would be three resources that I would strongly recommend.
Okay. All right. This has been a really valuable conversation. I really appreciate it. Are there any last comments that you would give before we kind of wrap things up for today?
Yeah, the only other one I would just say, a little more resources, a guy named Seth Godin, who's kind of like a cultural commentator or sociologist. He wrote a book called Survival is Not Enough. It's really small. It's a small book. You can read it really quickly. I found that book to be extremely helpful when it comes to leading through change. But really to wrap it up for me, Bill, is just that leadership is have its challenges, but I also think that leadership should be a source of joy. And so if you're leading and I don't mean every second of it, because there's certainly difficult times, sad times, But if you don't have a general arc of joy in your leadership, then I think maybe you ought to take a step back and see if God has another role or another seat or another thing for you to do. Because I really feel like whether you're leading in business, in education, in the church world, in the nonprofit, in some kind of government arena, wherever you're leading, you ought to have great joy in the assignment that God has given you over time, a general arc of joy. And if you don't, I'd encourage you to take a step back and really see, is this really what God made me to do?
Yeah. Am I really in the center of God's will, or is this just a
Yeah.
position I really wanted? And so, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Jimmy, thank you so much for being with me today. For those of you who are listening, watching, thanks for joining us. And I will have a new episode for you next week. God bless.